Hi everyone, how's the volume? Okay, I saw a thumbs up from Ray. Thank you. I am Molly Blakowski. You saw me earlier. I'm at Utah State and USGS, and I have a crew of awesome people here with me today to talk about dust, everyone's favorite topic, right? And to start off, I'm going to ask you to travel back to simpler times, say 10 years ago. There's no COVID. I don't think there's TikTok yet. Things are a little bit different. Besides in the context of cleaning, raise your hand if 10 years ago you thought about dust on a regular basis. Not about cleaning. Okay, so these are the hands. Yeah, there's a few. There's enough for you guys for sure. Okay, now how about a show of hands for the folks who currently think about dust on a day-to-day basis? A lot more hands now, okay, not just the nerds. So dust may be tiny, but its impacts are huge. Exposure to dust particles is associated with a variety of different health conditions, ranging from cardiovascular to respiratory. There are infections like valley fever that we have to worry about. And the socioeconomic consequences of dust storms are huge as well, and some of these are public safety concerns. So we have ground and air transportation safety hazards to consider as well. And with current climate trends and water needs, we're looking at a drier, dustier future with implications for the economy, air quality, human health, and ecosystems. On top of all that, we know there is less information about how lake levels impact dust risks in comparison to some other topics, like salinity levels or wetlands impairment, and so on. So today we're gathering to talk about what do we know about Great Salt Lake dust right now? What are we still trying to figure out? And what lessons can we learn from other saline lakes? And with that, I'm just going to let these folks take it away. What this session is going to look like is we're going to have 3 short presentations, and then we're going to have a Q&A session where I have some questions I've already written down, and then we'd like to open it up to the audience for questions as well.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be back. I can get this thing to stand up a little bit. All right, the topic of my talk today is monitoring and measuring in perpetuity. In the same vein, the same theme as protecting and preserving Great Salt Lake in perpetuity. Monitoring, air quality monitoring, is the backbone of Great Basin's program, our scientific program, to develop the best scientific data for informed decision-making that we have. I've been here before to talk about the success of our program, the success of PM10 emissions, our pioneering spirit in developing dust control implementations and strategies. So today, I'd like to talk about air quality monitoring. So Great Basin is a 3-county special district. We enforce federal, state, and local air quality laws. It's our responsibility to protect public health from the harmful effects of air pollution. And part of our mission statement is also to protect the environment from the harmful effects of air pollution, which we're learning isn't just human health, but it's also plant health and animal health. So the scope is a lot bigger. There's been a lot of talk about water. And the value of water, the use of water, the valuable resource that it is. One common theme that I've seen over the years of coming back is the interconnectivity of the stakeholders that are part of this group and people trying to solve the problem in their own watershed and airshed. At Great Basin, our story is a little bit different because the water users are not in the airshed. So the people that use the water resource, that get value from the water resource, are actually not the people breathing the toxic air pollution, which creates a little bit of a conundrum. Here we have Owens Lake, and my talk today isn't just about Owens Lake, it's also about Mona Lake. But it ties into, other lakes. Hearing Jeff McQuilkin talk today about Mona Lake and hearing Michael Cohen talk about Salton Sea, it's really fortunate for them and fortunate for you at the Great Salt Lake that you guys still have water, because there's still a lot you can do and ways to solve those problems. When I'm going to talk about air quality monitoring, I think the reason why Great Basin is so far ahead of the learning curve is because at Owens Lake we haven't had water for over 100 years. All we've had is the toxic dust. This is what a PM10 dust event looked like, and hearing Anna McIntyre talk this morning about her trip out to Great Salt Lake and the visible dust emissions from the lake. When you're looking, at least out at Owens Lake, and you can see visible dust, this is what we call an instantaneous value, right? It's what you see at the moment. To even see dust, it's about 400 micrograms per cubic meter. The National Ambient Air Quality Standard is 150 micrograms per cubic meter over a 24-hour period. So if those visible dust emissions were to be maintained for a 24-hour period, you'd be 2 to 3 times over that federal standard. What people don't realize is actually how high the federal standard is for the amount of pollution that's in the air if your wind events are very episodic, very short durations, or very strong, like a high magnitude of wind with a very large open source. And so something like this at Owens Lake, you can have hourly concentrations of up to 15,000 micrograms. And so, the point I wanted to bring home with this picture is the importance of air quality. We've talked a lot about the land, the water, the air. We haven't talked about fire coming to your doorstep near you here in Salt Lake, I'm sure, as well, with the fire issues we have and the excessive fuel loading. But, just to put this in perspective, what we're seeing here with the air quality and the diminished air quality, it's an externalization of the benefit of water, or a water production business, or any other use of water. It's because of the water that isn't available that we have these air pollution emissions. And to control these emissions, it isn't cheap. At Owens Lake, we've spent over $2.5 billion to control about 50 square miles of emissive areas. And it keeps adding up. The operations and maintenance are at least 25 million, if not up to 50 million a year. And that doesn't include the cost of water offset to control some of these. So let's talk about the air quality monitoring. We have several different tools for the same sort of issue. What is the air quality? How bad is it? What is the uniformity of those air quality conditions? What are the distances of downwind impacts? What are the upwind concentrations and incoming particulate emissions to the area? Trying to answer those scientific questions is not easy, and they can be argued over extensively. Here you're looking at 4 different, more permanent air quality monitors, both in the northern part of the Great Basin, central part of the Great Basin, and the southern part of the Great Basin at Owens Lake. A lot of these you can consider like fixed monitoring or permanent monitoring. They're federal reference method monitors. And this is an EPA designated type of monitoring station. Once these air quality stations are established, if there are exceedances of the national standard, monitors have to be maintained and kept in a location. You can't just take them out. You can't ignore the air quality measurements that are taken from these monitors. And that brings into question is, well, if you don't want to know, what would you do? You wouldn't want to monitor. And that's a dilemma that I think people face, is knowing the hard truth of what the conditions are. And the hard reality of it too is that it costs a lot of money. It would cost $100,000 a year to run one of these permanent fixed monitors, as far as equipment, staffing, and all the associated costs with running a monitor. So if you're running 10 monitors, you're looking at $1 million budget just for annual operations and maintenance of these permanent fixed federal reference monitors. Here you have monitors that are both line powered, so when they have accessibility to a power infrastructure, the 2 on the top, and then the 2 on the bottom are low powered monitors because there is no power source other than the sun and the batteries that these can rely on, which is challenging in different geographic areas, like up at Mono Lake where we have the Pocanip, where the freezing fog will have 3 to 5 days without sun. So to keep these monitors up and running that have specific data capture requirements can be challenging. We also have a lot of portable air quality monitoring, and these tools actually are quite valuable. For one, because they can cost a lot less. You can move them around, and you can change the type of air quality monitor you use for the specific pollutant. Up there on your far left, there's what we call a baby Huey. And listening to Tim and the Dust Forum's goal to seek funding supply, this was a monitor that we purchased with Homeland Security money after 9/11. And so, if the Great Salt Lake group here is looking for ways to spend Inflation Reduction Act money, it's a good investment to divert some of that to air quality monitoring. Really neat to see a Dust Forum being established here with the Great Salt Lake. Hopefully it'll be totally worthless because the lake will still be full of water. We have in the upper right there, this is an EBAM monitor. And the EBAM, it's a great tool for measuring PM 2.5. It uses an optical sensor, so it does a much better job at measuring PM 2.5. That's a lot of wood smoke contribution. Doesn't perform very well for us for dust. And then on the bottom, we have this very low-cost air sensor. I think these things are about $30. And a lot of people are familiar with these just because of their rollout. As a low-cost sensor that is quite reliable, it has an optical sensor, and can be deployed really easy to anywhere that has Wi-Fi. But again, these are great for measuring PM 2.5 with wood smoke contributions. And we've actually dissected these and used the sensor that Plant Power makes, and have run some experiments around Owens Lake to see how well it monitors dust, and it doesn't monitor very well at all. Monitoring allows you to determine your success or lack thereof. Here you can see the decreasing, so you've got Owens Lake in blue, Mono Lake in red, and then all other sources of PM10 in the United States in that sort of green color. And so, how do you know where you're at if you're not monitoring? Well, you need to be monitoring. And the more extensive your monitoring network, the better characterization you're going to get of those sources, and the better characterization you're going to get of the impacts to the public and your community. But if you're not monitoring, you have no idea where you're at. The good news is here at Great Salt Lake, you don't make it onto this chart at all. What I did want to talk about a little bit was the ambient air monitoring in Utah, because I had been asked questions about this at previous forums and really didn't have an answer. And so what I had my staff do was query the National Ambient Air Quality System database. This is public information that anybody can access, and sort of look at what's going on here so I can bring this to the group. And here in Utah, the state of Utah, you guys have 7 different sites with more monitors, and you have 21 PM2.5 sites. What you're looking at, just to kind of summarize it, is both the site location, what county it's in, and what site identification number, and there's what's called a POC, which is a parameter of occurrence. So you can have multiple monitors at the same site. You can have different methods of monitoring. So these are little nuances I think that's important to consider. What type of observation interval do you want to measure at? Do you want or need a continuous 24/7, 365 monitor, or can you run a filter base, which is sort of the gold standard of air quality monitoring? Maybe monitor a 1 in 6 day frequency. Is that going to be adequate? Or, these are important questions to ask. And, an important question to ask is why. I'm going to end here on this slide. And this is compiling, I think things that are near Great Basin, which is Mono Lake and Owens Lake, and our monitoring networks there, and then kind of comparing that to the Great Salt Lake. Mono Lake, that's the actual lake level. Owens Lake, was the lake level in 1913. Great Salt Lake, we have different lake levels. You guys know it fluctuates quite dramatically. The black dots are air quality monitoring stations, and the wind roses are the wind data from 2023. So when citing or trying to determine when you want to cite, or where you want to cite your air quality monitor, there's a lot of considerations, right? As to where are our population sources, where are the biggest impacts to public health, what are our prevailing wind patterns. At Mono Lake, we have 2 monitors, which Great Basin feels is adequate. We have an upwind monitor and a downwind monitor from the primary source of PM10 from the exposed lake bed. And you can see there in that wind rose that, and those that aren't familiar with wind roses are looking at the wind direction and then the frequency of that wind direction and then also the magnitude. So your higher frequencies radiate out to that specific wind direction the wind is blowing from, and then your higher concentrations are typically at the end of that wind rose. At Owens Lake, we had 2 prevailing wind patterns, both from the northwest, and then the southwest. We have a monitoring network that's equally distributed around the lake. This is the most intensive monitoring source of PM in the nation. I had an opportunity to hear DWP talk about this today. This is the Department of Water and Power on a National Academy of Sciences meeting about how extensive this is. But even with the 9 monitors around the lake, including the one on Lone Pine, we only capture probably 90% of the really important emissive areas. We still, a lot of times, are extrapolating and using air quality modeling data to fill those in. Here at Great Salt Lake, you can see the air quality monitoring is focused around the communities. Is that adequate? There's a lot of development. I think up in Box Elder Canyon and to the north, we've heard some talks about water developments up there in the Bear River. And then, in addition to the air quality monitoring, there's an opportunity for direct emission monitoring with, on the lake bed, sensit and sand catching devices. We have over 200 at Owens Lake. So it sort of summarizes where we're at with Great Basin, and maybe hopefully useful for this group of where you want to go or where you can be at maybe in the future.
So I'm Kevin Perry, Professor of Atmospheric Sciences here at the University of Utah. Brian Steed has been often called, or he's been saying he's being called Dr. Doom. A lot of people have been calling me Dr. Dust. I've had my head in dust for 30 years, and specifically looking at dust associated with Great Salt Lake for, has it been 8 years? I guess it's been 8 years. But I want to kind of put things into perspective and deal with a few misconceptions that are common in the media and the general population as well. And a lot of it has to do with a matter of scale. We were just looking at Mono Lake, which is about 65 square miles, and Owens Lake, which is over 100 square miles. Great Salt Lake, this is from November of 2022. We have more than 800 square miles of exposed lake bed. And you can take Mono Lake and Owens Dry Lake, and you can put it in Farmington Bay, which is down in the bottom right-hand corner, and still have room left over, just in terms of the scale. That would be truly scary if Great Salt Lake were as emissive as Owens Lake. But Great Salt Lake is not the biggest dust source in Utah, not even close. There's Severe Dry Lake, there are other dry lake beds, there's the West Desert. There are many, many dust sources in Utah that dwarf Great Salt Lake as a dust source, but proximity matters when it comes to exposure. Great Salt Lake, literally, you have dust plumes that come off the lake bed and can be in your backyard for some of these communities in 5 minutes. And so that poses a different type of health risk that we should be concerned about. Get this to work. So what we're looking at here is kind of a poster child for a dust event. We're looking from the University of Utah down towards downtown with the state capitol off to the right. Great Salt Lake is off to the right. Winds were from the south, and then the winds are going to reverse, come from the north, and bring a dust event into the city. these dust events that are bringing the dust into the city are relatively short-lived, a few hours. And so, if you're looking at a 24-hour average, it doesn't necessarily top the national ambient air quality standards, but it doesn't mean that it isn't unhealthy for the people that are breathing that at the time, with the hourly concentrations being much higher. The other thing is about the seasonality of the dust at Great Salt Lake. We have air quality challenges here in Utah in the wintertime associated with cold air pools and trapping our local pollutants. We have air quality challenges in the summertime associated with wildfire and ozone. And generally speaking, we have good air quality in the spring and the fall. Unfortunately, that's the time period when the dust events are most likely to occur due to the passage of the cold fronts. Spring really is dependent upon how wet it's been. When we have a wet spring, we don't get many things coming off Great Salt Lake. The fall is typically drier, and that's actually one of the more common time periods when we can expect dust coming off of Great Salt Lake. So what are some of the questions that I've been asking? And do a real quick cursory discussion of that here, but where are the dust hotspots? Are there anything potentially harmful heavy metals in the dust? And how do fluctuating lake levels impact dust emission? And in order to do this, you kind of have to understand what controls dust emission from the playa surfaces. And it really comes down to vegetation will slow the wind speed down, the root structure will help hold the dust in place. So you really want to have an area that's not vegetated. You want to have an area that has sufficient fine material, silt and clay, in order for it to be able to be a dust source. And then Great Salt Lake is very much controlled by a physical crust that exists on the surface of the lake bed, and much of it. And in order for the dust to be a hot spot, you need to have an area that has no crust or an erodible crust. And we have this Venn diagram. 85% of the lake is non-vegetated. We've got 22% of the lake which has significant amounts of silt and clay. And we've got about 17% of the lake bed which has no crust or an erodible shallow crust. You put all that together, and in 2018 when I finished this survey, only about 9% of the lake bed was actually acting as a potential dust source. That changes over time. We suspect it changes over time as the crust, the longer it's exposed to the environment, the more likely it is to erode. And so we fully expect that 9% number from 2018 has increased. But in 2018, about 75% of the lake bed was covered up with a crust, whether it was a shallow crust, just a few millimeters, all the way up to several centimeters. Basically, 3/4 of the lake bed was covered, had an intact crust. And then the other parts of the lake had crust that was either in some type of eroding state or no crust at all. So everybody asks me, what's a dust hotspot actually look like? Well, you know it when you see it. So here's an example of an area that had a very thin, few millimeter crust on the top. The crust eroded away through the process of saltation. When you have sand that moves along the surface, it can break up these really thin crusts. And then you have wind erosion in the area in the center there, and this is now a divot in the lake bed. These are persistent from year to year and get larger and larger over time. Just to give you an example of how thin that crust was at that site, it's very, very fragile. Any type of activity, motorized activity, would be detrimental to the crust on many parts of Great Salt Lake. But over time, these dust hotspots grow in size and turn into dust hotspot areas. Luckily, in 2018, there weren't many of these dust hotspot areas, but that is the future of the lake bed the longer that it is exposed. So where are these dust hotspots located? Well, it's equal opportunity. Every quadrant of the lake has its own dust hotspot issues. Farmington Bay has a lot, as does Bear River Bay up in the northeastern part. Extreme northwestern, and also over near US Magnesium in the EPA Superfund site over on that side as well. So everybody always asks me, do I live downwind from Great Salt Lake? And the windrows that you were showing was indicating clearly that we have winds from multiple directions, and with these dust events, we get wind that is from the south, prior to the cold fronts, and as the front reverses, it moves from the north to the south. And so we've got these four dust hotspot areas, and where that dust is moving depends upon what part of the storm you're actually in. And you might have noticed that there were very few particulate matter sensors north and east of the lake, where we have the strongest winds that are pushing this material up into an area where we don't have monitors. And that's one of the reasons I did the soil survey as opposed to just relying upon the availability of the DAQ monitors. And the other thing that I want to note is that the DAQ has actually shut down most of the PM10 filter-based samplers for Utah. They replaced them with continuous monitoring for PM10 and PM2.5. And that's great for looking at those hourly exposures, but it doesn't allow us to be able to do the chemical composition measurements necessary in order to identify the source of that material along the way. So in terms of potential health impacts, there's really acute effects and chronic effects. Acute is you're just breathing in the PM2.5 and PM10 and PM2.5. Molly talked about the potential health impacts associated with that. But there can also be chronic long-term exposure issues if you happen to have carcinogens in the dust as well. And just lastly there, I just want to say that everybody along Wasatch Front, all the way from Tremonton up to Tooele and everything in between, are downwind of the lake at some point. So in order to kind of understand the potential risk associated with carcinogens in the lake bed, it's helpful to look at what we call regional screening levels from the Environmental Protection Agency. And the regional screening level is basically trying to figure out what would be a concentration of a contaminant in the soil or water or air that, given an assumed dose and the known toxicity, would lead to incidences of cancer above 1 in a million. And this is basically just a real quick pass. And concentrations that are less than the regional screening levels are deemed safe for carcinogens. And those that are greater than the regional screening levels really deserve more attention to figure out what the dose is that people are actually being exposed to. And it just turns out that there were 13 contaminants of potential concern on Great Salt Lake that had concentrations greater than the regional screening levels. And by far, the one that gets the most attention and has been labeled toxic dust. I've never said toxic dust. That is a media manifestation, a clickbait sort of thing. It is a contaminant of potential concern. I will definitely go there, and it deserves more study. But I'm not a toxic dust guy. That's not me. So what we're looking at here is kind of a histogram of the arsenic concentrations in the soil. And these are the PM10 particles, the ones that actually get in your lungs. The red line and the green line on the left are the regional screening levels. Every single measurement that I took out in Great Salt Lake was more than an order of magnitude greater than the regional screening levels. Does that mean we're going to die from exposure to arsenic? No. But what it does mean is that we need to do more measurements to find out whether or not and at what concentrations this material is actually getting transported to the surrounding communities. The arsenic was actually fairly evenly distributed across the Great Salt Lake. It was one of the more evenly distributed elements. And if you are concerned about arsenic exposure, it can lead to lung cancer, skin cancer, bladder cancer. Those are the most common ones associated with that. But here's the bad story. Even if we didn't have any lake dust that had arsenic in it, we are very polluted for arsenic in northern Utah from other sources. And what we're looking at here is 20 years worth of arsenic data from the Bountiful site. And this is PM10 arsenic. It was measured with ICP-MS. And the average concentration is about 0.94 nanograms per cubic meter. It's less than 1 nanogram per cubic meter. You say, geez, a nanogram, that's like nothing. Well, if you do the calculation of what that translates to in terms of a carcinogenic risk, the cancer risk, you can actually take that value of approximately 1 nanogram per cubic meter. You look at it in terms of the inhalation unit risk that has been determined from laboratory studies. You look at the 20-year exposure for this data set. Expected lifetime is 78 years, And even without any dust from Great Salt Lake, we're right at the cancer risk of 1 in a million, which indicates that the EPA should probably be doing a toxicological effect analysis. Any additional arsenic that you would get from the lake or, would just compound our already polluted environment for this particular element. But arsenic wasn't the only contaminant of potential concern. There were others, lanthanum, lithium, zirconium, cobalt, manganese, copper. Some of these had many concentrations greater than the regional screening levels. Others are point sources that can be explained. And then we also had aluminum, iron, antimony, thallium, vanadium, and uranium. So what does all this mean? It means we need to find out what the dose is that people are actually being exposed to, which means we need more, not less, PM10 measurements from DAQ and EPA. And we also need to do more research on the bioavailability to find out to what extent these elements are locked up in minerals that can interact with your body or not, sort of thing. And lastly, I just want to say, everybody always asks me, well, we've had 2 great, snowpacks, and the water's come up a lot. What has that done for the dust hotspots? And I did all of the analysis, Casey, Root, for the bathymetry and sort of thing before you did this. If I'd known you were going to do it, I would have waited. It was a pain in the butt. But using that LiDAR data and the bathymetry and figuring out the datums and all that sort of stuff myself, this was the distribution of dust hotspots in Farmington Bay back in 2018 when the lake was at about 4195. So kind of comparable, a little bit lower than it is right now, sort of thing. And on the x-axis, which I know you can't see in the back, is the lake level from 4192 up to 4210. And the y-axis is the fraction of dust hotspots that are covered up at different lake levels in Farmington Bay. And it's about a 13% gradient, which means for every foot rise, you decrease the dust hotspots by about 13%. And unfortunately, we went 6 feet below this. And this is a very linear trend. If you did the extrapolation, it would have said that during that time period over the last 5 years when the lake was all the way down to 4188, we actually increased the number of dust hotspots by 40%. It hasn't been verified, it's extrapolation sort of thing. And now the lake is back up to about where it was in 2018. But the lake is at 4195, close up there, sort of thing. So we've still got a lot of dust hotspots that are way above that. And in order to get 80% of the dust hotspots covered that I looked at back in 2018, you'd have to get all the way up to over 4,200, sort of thing. And I love Bagley. Well, that was a great water year, but the lake must be this high before we can breathe easy. So I'll leave it at that.
Sara Grineski. I'm a professor at the University of Utah in Sociology and Environmental Studies. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today, in 10 minutes or less, about social disparities in exposure to fine particulates currently, and then what we might anticipate happening in the future. So check out my map. What do you notice? The front half of the room is going to have to carry the group, because I was sitting in the back and I know you can't see the bottom half of this map. So what do you notice in this map? Now, what are the red spots? Yeah, they're moderate inversion conditions at Salt Lake County Public Schools. So every orange dot is a public school. And the bigger dots mean there was higher levels of fine particulate matter. It's a moderate inversion. The standard is 35. You can see the big orange circles are about 35, and the other ones are a little bit less than moderate standard. What do you see happening in the background of the map? Yeah, ethnicity and race, right? It's shaded. Those are census tracts. I've removed the lines, which are basically neighborhoods, so it's easier to see. But do you see the really strong sort of east-west gradient with respect to race ethnicity here in Salt Lake County? Right? We know this, I think, a lot of us, but it's pretty powerful to see it there on the map, right? So now, think about the orange dots and the map in the background. What do you notice? Right, where we have higher proportions of people of color, our air pollution, in this case during moderate inversion conditions, is higher, right? So this is an example of distributional environmental injustice, when we have an environmental hazard and it's unequally or unjustly distributed with respect to characteristics of people. I've done this type of work in a lot of places, and Salt Lake County is one of the places where you can actually see the pattern with your own eyes just looking at a map. You don't even need fancy statistics, right? The patterns here are very strong. So we've been talking about particulate matter. Particulate matter, what I'm going to focus on here is fine particulate matter, PM2.5, which is about 1/20th the diameter of a hair. So PM2.5 can get pretty deep into your lungs. It's included, dust includes PM2.5, it also has larger particles. But PM2.5 is my focus today because there's so many health concerns with PM2.5. It's the leading environmental cause of human mortality worldwide. Here in the US, they estimate about 50,000 premature deaths per year due to PM2.5. So just a little bit more on the health to pick up on our previous presenters. Dust exposures, based on academic literature, they're very well established health risk factors. A recent scoping review found 204 studies of the health effects of dust, and 85% of those studies had statistically significant associations with the health outcomes, most commonly respiratory and cardiovascular morbidity, as well as mortality. There's much less literature on the health effects of dust from drying terminal lakes, but a study of the Salton Sea demonstrated a relationship. I did some of my own work in El Paso County, which is also a very dusty place. We looked at dust events and if there were hospitalizations for asthma and acute bronchitis after those dust events. We found for people of all ages, so if there was a 23% increase in the risk of being hospitalized for acute bronchitis the day after a dust storm compared to any other clean day. And for kids, that risk was 33% higher. So kids were more likely to be hospitalized the day after a dust storm for acute bronchitis compared to a clean day. And I show you this picture of my son. He was hospitalized for viral pneumonia after I took him to the zoo in a dust storm. And I share this picture just because we can say 33% more likely, but sometimes we forget the people that are actually in the data, right? Each of those hospitalizations is a person, right, who was suffering. So locally here, moving back to the distribution of PM2.5, there are inequalities, right? I already told you about this in that opening map. These are the same data again. So now I have a clean air scenario, a moderate inversion, which you saw in the intro slide, and then a very severe inversion on the right. The blue dots now are the schools. You can see as you move from east to west, there's some differences north to south. And we're trying to capture typical air quality conditions under these different weather scenarios. And then, when we do a statistical analysis here, right, and we look at associations between school demographics and air quality exposures, we see that when the air is pretty good, when the air is moderately bad but not absolutely horrible, and when the air is incredibly terrible, the proportion of students at the school who are people of color is significantly related to the level of air. So whether the air is really bad or the air is not so bad, we still see this disparity here in the Salt Lake. This is schools. We've done similar work at the neighborhood level in the Salt Lake metropolitan statistical area. These here are just correlations between the proportion of people from different backgrounds in a census tract and the level of chronic PM2.5, so annual average. And you see pretty strong, for social scientists, these are strong correlations between the PM2.5 and the sociodemographics, specifically with respect to Hispanic, Black, American Indian, Pacific Islander folks here in Salt Lake metropolitan statistical area. So I don't know about you, but the question for me, and this came up, I was invited to speak last March at the Great Salt Lake Symposium. about this work. And I thought, okay, the right analysis for this audience is, what is the dust going to do to these pre-existing disparities that we've already measured? And I had no answer last March of 2023, but I am arriving at an answer now. So how might these disparities be exacerbated by dust from the Great Salt Lake? So a team of folks, which includes Kevin here, are investigating this. I think we're investigating this now, but 2 days ago our paper was accepted, so I guess we investigated it. So this is a brand new info. So we're interested in how dusty it might get and where the dust might go. I'm a sociologist. This is my area of expertise, right? But I collaborated with Derek Malia and Kevin Perry and other folks who really know about dust and where it might go. So Derek Malia and his team looked at, they simulated dust emissions and transport for all dust events in the spring of 2022. Right, we know how high the lake was, we know from the air quality monitors how much dust there was. So he used this information and then created 4 dust models. The first one would be this hypothetical no lake scenario where like the entire lake is full. Now, researchers say this is somewhat unlikely with the Great Salt Lake because of defect mechanisms, that there's still be a little bit of water in the lake, but people are concerned about the lake drying up, right? So we did a model for if there was no lake at all. That's A. Then we did model B, which is very low lake, right? So this assumes low inflow, no conservation measures, and the lake gets even worse than it was, right, in 2022. Then we have what we call current lake, because that's what the data came from with our spring 2022 dust storms, which was that average from 2020 to 2022. So it's a little better than very low lake, but it's not quite as high as what we're calling healthy lake, which is the level at which people believe we have healthy ecosystems and unhealthy ecosystems, right? So that's our healthy lake there, and you can see there, that's what the dust models look like. The red spots are high levels of dust. So you can see Kennecott there as well as the Great Salt Lake sort of jumping out. So these dust surfaces reveal that all Wasatch Front residents, we did a 3-county study. So across Weber, Davis, and Salt Lake face potentially unhealthy levels of dust. So this is just PM2.5 dust. It does not include dust that's larger than PM2.5 or existing PM2.5 emissions from what other sources might be near source. So you can see that these levels could be potentially unhealthy for folks here. But, I mean, who is the average Salt Lake County resident, right? We know the city has dramatic patterns of social segregation. So we looked at the population-weighted mean predicted exposure to dust PM2.5 by demographic group. You can't read this, I just didn't want you to think I was making this up. It's real, we did that, didn't just ask myself, but I didn't stand up. So what did we find? We found that racial ethnic minority residents, particularly Pacific Islanders, and secondarily the Hispanic Latinx community, have higher predicted exposures to dust from PM2.5 as compared to non-Hispanic white people in all 4 lake scenarios. What's interesting is that the disparities are relatively higher when the lake levels are actually lower. And I found the same pattern looking at education, so comparing folks who have a high school diploma or more to those who don't. So I just took these numbers here, I subtracted them here for you. And you can see that, for example, the first row, the differences in dust PM2.5 between Pacific Islanders and non-Hispanic. You can see the difference when there's no lake would be 5 micrograms per cubic meter. In a healthy lake, the difference between those groups is only 1.9. So not only do the exposures go down, they also narrow. Right? You can see this for all the racial ethnic minority groups. So the largest difference is going to the Pacific Islanders and Hispanic. We also see it for people with high school diploma versus. Interestingly, there were no meaningful differences based on income or housing tenure, right? If you rent or own. And I actually sort of probed into that income finding quite a bit. I'm like, well, what if I try this break? What if I try this break? What if I try this break? I made all kinds of different income groups, 4 groups, 3 groups, 2 groups. I couldn't find anything for it. Right? And that may be surprising, although I think locally the pattern of environmental injustice with respect to fine particulates is driven, is associated more strongly with race than
Those were all great. We do have another important person here with us, Representative Ray Ward, a very, very busy person, and I want to let Representative Ward introduce himself, and then I know a lot of you probably have questions, but because I organized this session, I get to ask my questions first. So I'm going to do that, but then I want to make sure that you all have time to ask questions too. So I think these microphones are working. You want to give it a shot?
Sure. And so when I saw that I was invited to this panel and that they said, if you're on this panel, you should submit a slide deck. And I said, I do not have a slide deck. I can come sit on the panel, but I don't have a slide deck. I'm a family practice physician. I see primary care patients in Bountiful. Every one of my constituents and patients looks out their window and sees the lake downhill from them. And I'm in the legislature where I care about these issues, but I don't have any scientific expertise other than that. I got a PhD back in the day with getting my MD, but that was all in antipsychotic medications in rat brains. So that's what I bring to the panel.
Well, let's start out with a question for you. How often do you hear from your constituents or your patient, I know there's patient confidentiality, but how often are people talking to you about Great Salt Lake dust concerns?
So I would say among my constituents, there is a large amount of general concern about the lake just being there in the future for their kids. I think that's widespread throughout my community that people wish for there to be a healthy lake now and into the future. I don't really think on a day-to-day basis there's a lot of concern about dust there. I mean, patients in general still perceive inversions the most, and if there's a bad inversion, we'll be able to tell that we'll see a few more of our patients that have asthma that will show up. So people still have that in mind, but at least so far I have not seen a direct correlation with dust from the lake that has brought patients into the clinic.
And this is for anybody. Are there any common misconceptions or frequently overlooked concerns about the potential effects of dust on human or ecosystem health that you'd like to discuss? I knew you'd have something.
Yeah, I'm always surprised by the number of people after the media reports that basically call me up and said, should I move my family out of Utah? Are we all going to die? And I try and walk them back from the precipice that, this is an emerging issue that is contributing to an overall situation where the air quality in Utah has been improving significantly over the last 20 to 30 years. We've made significant gains, but this is just one of those things that threatens or, potentially acts to reduce our air quality improvements over time. And the other thing is that the wonderful thing about dust as opposed to wildfire smoke is your N95 mask that we've all used for COVID is actually a very effective tool for reducing your personal exposure if you're really concerned about it.
Kevin, while I have you with the mic.
We've got another.
I just want to.
Oh, please go ahead.
My same answers that I would give to those questions that got asked to Kevin. Should I move my family out of Utah? I really don't think so. It's really pretty nice here most of the time. There's probably a lot of other troubles wherever you might move. Are we all going to die? Yes.
You heard it first, we're all gonna die.
I mean, just to say, right?
Someday.
We are all going to die from something at some point. And I think the threats from dust are very real threats. I mean, you look around the world at other lakes where things have gone really bad, but these are largely threats in the future for now, and we're I think of doing the best we can now to mitigate the future problem overall. But because they're future, it's not always easy to know exactly which individual action we can take or exactly which policy will make the most difference. But I think the legislature has made honest and significant attempts to do things now that will add up to big changes later. Those programs are still in their first couple of years, and it's a big shift to turn. So if those programs will make a difference is still an open question and still will require checking on the effects of those programs and then making other adjustments in the future.
You mentioned lakes elsewhere, so I'm going to turn it to Phill. What is the biggest lesson learned from other lakes that we should keep in mind for Great Salt Lake? What would you do in our shoes right now?
I think the biggest lesson learned for this group is that every system is very unique. And there's always more things to learn, even when you think you've figured it all out. You know, listening to Kevin talk today about hotspots reminds me of a time at Owens Lake when we were having a discussion about the bottle cap theory and being able to control emissions by putting a bottle cap on first saltating particle before the source area started to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And, you know, the lake beds change, the salts are dynamic, the weather patterns aren't as consistent year after year, the precipitation patterns change, and so, you know, investing in long-term programs to have the best available knowledge and to continue to learn, I think it will best serve everybody in every area, even though our problems are different.
I just wanted to add one thing to that. It seems to me, from an outside perspective, that after $2.5 billion, we learned that the most effective way to prevent dust is to put water back on the lake.
Yeah, and I really wish that lesson was learned in the Mono Basin as well, where we're trying to solve the same issue and our control strategy is with lake level, and yet we can't get there.
So I do want to just, I mean, I don't know if it's a color commentary or a different perspective. Even with that said, that the most effective way is to put water back on the lake, that option is available in California right now today. You could take all that water from Los Angeles, you could put it back on the lake. But California does not choose to do that because right now today, those people using that water would strongly oppose that and they still want their water way more. So it's not even close to saying, you know, we're just going to cut Los Angeles off and put that water back on the lake. Once people get used to using water, they're not going to not use that water easily, and they will not choose to put it back, even if there's other healthcare effects that go with it. So, in my mind, figuring out some plan that we make ahead of time, we just can't get it back. The choice is always to still use your water once your livelihood is dependent on it.
I have a question for Sara now. What are some of the specific challenges associated with studying potential health risks specific to Great Salt Lake dust?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's why you don't see tons of studies in the literature specifically on the lake. I mean, in many cases, a lake might not be by a large population center, which means you may not have enough people to be able to do a high-quality epidemiological study. It's also tricky in general just to isolate the health effects of one specific environmental cause from all kinds of other causes, right, that affect our health. We know that there's many, many things that go into our health, and the environment is sometimes one of many factors, and sometimes environmental factors intersect with other factors like social stress to make us more vulnerable to illness, and so it can be hard to sort of isolate that effect. Now, the research is pretty advanced in terms of their statistical techniques. Like the study I shared with you in El Paso, it uses this method called a case crossover design, where basically each person who is hospitalized is compared to themselves as a control. So it's like, why were you hospitalized on this Tuesday as compared to 2 Tuesdays before or 2 Tuesdays after? And they often do the day of the week because if you look at hospitalization data, there's actually day of the week effects. Like we try not to go into the hospital on the weekends, right? So it's interesting how people, try to manage their lives in light of, medical emergencies. So we control for the day of the week. And then because in those types of methods, each person is compared to themselves, it addresses all kinds of issues like, well, did they smoke? Well, odds are you smoked 2 Tuesdays ago and 2 Tuesdays after, right? So it helps us sort of deal with all the other things that influence health. So there are pretty good methods out there. I think the studies are trustworthy, but it is tricky to isolate specifically, especially in one person's case, if the environment and how it played a role. But at a population level, the evidence is quite strong.
Thanks for that explanation. And as a side note, we just received USGS funding from the Risk Community of Practice to conduct a study comparing Great Salt Lake dust events to potential health outcomes for different emergency departments, and that's in partnership with the Department of Health and Human Services, and Sara is also graciously involved in that study as well. And I do want to be mindful of time and get to some questions from the audience, but I have one last question I wanted to ask Kevin. We know that water diversions are part of the reason why Great Salt Lake levels are low. What about climate? And how does that affect dust?
Yeah, so I'm a member of the Great Salt Lake Strike Team, which is a group of academic researchers and people from the state. people much more knowledgeable about the hydrogeography of the lake than I am. So I'm just kind of parroting back what they're saying from the Great Salt Lake Strike team. And basically, there are three things that are contributing to the lake decline. One is over structural imbalance, overuse of water. But climate is also playing a role in, as the temperature increases, it increases the rate of evaporation and makes it harder to keep water in the lake. The Great Salt Lake Strike team determined that the current existing increase in temperatures in northern Utah are responsible for about 10% of the water deficit that has been observed in the lake over the last 30 years. In contrast, the ongoing mega drought is responsible for about 25%, but the water diversion depletion is responsible for about 2/3. So climate change is not the driving factor, but it's going to make it more difficult to keep water in the lake as we move forward.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions. So, okay, 3 minutes, in fact.
So as these lake beds dry out and the salts come to the surface, these efflorescing salts, you get really fine particles in the case of things like carbonate salts, like in Owens Lake or Mono Lake, whereas it's more these chloride salts that are in places like Big Salt Lake. So what's the role of those salts as particles that can continuously keep coming out of the sediments as that water is evaporating, and how do they play a role in the kind of dust pollution events that you guys have been studying?
Yeah, I'll start with the bicarbonates at Mono and Owens, which are heavy bicarbonate layers. The effluent, it grows like a cauliflower, and it depends on the precipitation, temperature, the evapotranspiration, the capillary action, and also the closeness to the surface of the water. At Mono Lake, we can actually see it grow, freeze, dissolve, blow away, and grow again in about a 48-hour cycle. And we do still get salt crust with the bicarbonates. It doesn't sound like the same good, durable salt crust with the chlorides, but we get both the capillary crust and an evaporative crust where they're very stable and there are no dust emissions. So it's a very dynamic surface at Owens and Mono.
At Great Salt Lake, only about 5% of the lake bed is actually covered with a halite crust, and the rest of it's kind of basically salty soil, but you really don't see those type of structures. Very, very common out there.
Well, I'd like to ask you about your mention of this frozen fog. And didn't I hear you say that? And how it's somewhat perpetual. And I think in terms of our inversions in the winter, but I wanted to understand what the difference is based on the fact that I think a lot of our inversion in the winter is attributed to transportation and traffic, right? Anyway, help me understand that distinction.
Yeah, I'm not an expert at the frozen fog or the pokernet, but we do see its formation at Mono. The lake isn't frozen, and there's still a lot of moisture in the air, and then it freezes and creates this dense layer that the sun isn't penetrating through, and so the surface dynamics are very different. It's not an emissive time at Mono Lake, but it is a time that we find very challenging to operate our equipment for air monitoring.
You were talking about, is it on? You were talking about a correlation of race and air quality. And I just, knowing that a lot of the air quality is based on elevation and proximity, I was wondering if you knew the cause of the disparity. Or any theories?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you have to look at the historical development of the city and where people settled. And I don't know tons about this, but I think when people initially settled, or the white settlers initially came here, right, they settled up through the mountains by mountain streams. And then over time, right, the city developed, there's some industrialization, there's redlining that happening, and so you just have sort of these socio-spatial processes that were not disconnected from race or racism, as well as economic opportunities, right, and housing prices, and those things also are influenced by people's race in terms of how much money they earn at their jobs and all of that. So it's really sort of a complex historical process, and you can think about individual particularities in each place, but we find similar patterns at a nationwide scale, and so similar processes with respect to where freeways went into cities in the United States after World War II, right? They were often put right through low-income and minority neighborhoods and cities. It was considered to be the path of least resistance, which then contributed to traffic pollution in those communities even still today. So the issues with the lake are a little bit different than freeways, but I think that the lake wasn't necessarily considered the most desirable place to live as compared to, up on the East Bench or closer to mountains and streams and rivers, especially when we think historically. So I think those sort of explanations might be relevant.
Do we have time for this very last question?
Okay. Thank you, Tony. Thank you all for being here. I apologize if this was addressed and I just missed it. I missed a portion of the presentation. But something that I have been paying a lot of attention to is the research emerging around how air pollution and particulate matter can contribute to the development of autism, Alzheimer's, and mental illness, and especially in areas of the world that experience thermal inversions. John Hopkins did a study here showing a strong correlation between suicide pollution and buildup of things in the atmosphere. I'm just wondering if any of you can speak to that.
Yeah, definitely. That's an area that I work on as well. I have an ongoing project about intellectual disability here in Utah and its relationship in terms of prenatal exposures to both industrial air pollutants as well as particulate matter. And I found pretty strong relationships specifically with preconception exposure, so those 12 weeks before conception, as well as in the first trimester of pregnancy. So if the PM2.5 average was higher as compared to lower, and a baby born in Utah was more likely to have intellectual disability than not. And we found something similar when we looked at the exceedances of 24-hour PM, so that an inversion event or a dust storm event or a smoke event. There were statistically significant relationships there too with respect to both the preconception and first trimester period. The literature on autism and prenatal exposures to PM finds that the second and third trimester are more risky than the preconception and first. So different disorders, the way in which we develop in the womb is incredibly complex, and so exposures at very specific points in time can shape someone's risk profile for diseases, for the rest of their life. So that's one example here in Utah, the intellectual disability work.
For me, and the way that I think about it, I don't think those kinds of questions are helpful. I think that there is an inclination to find two things that we think are a problem, and one is a horrible outcome, and then just search and search and search to find that this horrible thing also causes this other horrible thing. If only we could show this correlation, then finally people would listen to us and we would do something different. To me, I think most of my legislative colleagues believe, I think most of the people that I just know in my community want there to still be a lake there for 100 different reasons, and are willing to try and work in that direction, regardless of other individual correlations that might prove out to be true, and to just work in general in that direction. I think there's goodwill towards that in a lot of different places, but though the goodwill does not make the problem easy, it still is a really, really hard problem. But for me, I'm just, in general, interested in moving in that direction overall as best as we can.
Thank you all for your time. Thank you so much to our panelists, and sorry we went a little bit over.